Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 9 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Washington Capitals, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So their record now is 0-8-1. They remain the only winless team in the entire league, just a single point currently in the standings. And this was a game in which the Sharks actually had a good chance to win. Their first time this season facing off against a team that is relatively close to their level of skill. Most of the Sharks games thus far this year have been against really strong contenders, not even just playoff teams. Teams like the Hurricanes twice, the Lightning, the Panthers, the Bruins, the Golden Knights, even the Predators, the previous weakest team that the Sharks had played against this season, have looked not too bad. But the Capitals came in, they were near the bottom of the standings, I believe like 25th in the league, not exactly a great start for them, and so it seemed as though the Sharks could have the opportunity to win their first game if they so tried. And in the first period, it was looking actually kind of good. For the first time this season, in fact, the Sharks were outplaying a team over a full period of time. They were shooting pretty well. They were getting good offensive zone time. And in fact, they actually scored the one and only goal of the first period, coming from Luke Kunin to make it 1-0 San Jose. Now, here is where the issue comes up, of course. While this goal does prevent the Sharks from being shut out for 3 straight games, which would have been genuinely terrible, it does then just begin to match the current goals for per game average that the Sharks have been on this season, which is a flat 1.0. And so the major question was, could this be the second time this year in 9 games that the Sharks could actually score more than 1 goal, or would they actually have to hold on with a 1-0 shutout victory if they want to finally get into the win column? Through the second period, the Sharks do not get any goals, and things begin to even out a bit more. While the Sharks, I said, were the better team in the first period, it felt more even in that second frame, and the Capitals late in that period started to get some pretty good chances for themselves. However, still 0-0 scoreless second period, so a 1-0 lead for the Sharks going into the third period. The second time that this exact score has actually happened this season, back in Game 2 of the regular season against the Colorado Avalanche, the Sharks found themselves up 1-0 with 20 minutes to go with Mackenzie Blackwood in net, and they managed to hang on until the last 90 seconds before Cale Makar scored the game-tying goal, and eventually the Sharks would lose in post-regulation time. Here tonight, it did not take nearly as long. Dylan Strome would tie the game just a couple of minutes into the third period, which, of course, brought up the worries of, could the Sharks even score more than 1 goal to win this, or would we have to go straight to shootout? And, well, the Sharks, they stuck at their 1 goal as per usual. They just don't actually have the offensive weapons, in particular the offensive weapons from the back end, to really apply any sort of consistent pressure. And the Capitals were significantly better than the San Jose Sharks in the third period. They would get the go-ahead goal from Tom Wilson, a bit of a lucky one with just a few minutes to go in the third period to make it 2-1. And even though the Sharks would have 5 forwards on the ice in those last couple of minutes, and eventually pulling the goaltender to get a 6th forward on the ice, fully loading up in terms of offensive capability, because the Sharks have 0 players on the back end who could even help in this exact situation, there's no chances being generated. The Sharks could barely even enter the zone. Every entry, even with 1 extra player on the ice, was just completely stifled and forced the Sharks to dump it in. They had 0 retrieval skills of being able to win puck battles, force bad plays, and the Capitals quite quickly managed to generate themselves an empty net goal to make it 3-1 for Washington, and that would be the final score of the game. And so while the Sharks had the opportunity, it was a positive building game, I guess you could say, and you could also say that this kind of showed that the Sharks, when playing against other extremely weak competition in the league, they actually have a decent chance of being able to win. But at the end of the day, it is yet another loss for San Jose, and they are still searching for that first win, but it will not come in the month of October. On to the players to talk about, a couple of substitutions. First of all, we have the first line, which did remain the same, of Hertl, Duclair, and Zetterlund. Now, this line did start off the game really well. In the first period, when the Sharks actually outplayed the Capitals, this was perhaps their best line of that period. Duclair was actually looking rather solid. Hertl, who had been pretty much asleep the previous couple of games, also not looking too bad. But then as this game went on, things just completely disappeared from this first line. Duclair, it felt as though he just checked out after the first period. Same goes with Tomas Hertl. And then when it comes to Fabian Zetterlund, this is a mistake that David Quinn has made multiple times in the past with different players. It happened a lot last season where he'll see a player do well in like a particular role on like the fourth line or the third line, and he will immediately boost them up to the top six or even to the top line because, not exactly entirely Quinn's fault. There isn't exactly any better options at this point, but this is exactly what ends up happening with Zetterlund. He's playing very well in that middle six role, and so he gets bumped up to the top line with Hertl and Duclair and immediately puts up a couple of games where he just doesn't really have that same level of impact. And so Zetterlund, he was doing so well at the start of the season. It's just not the case anymore. A pretty invisible game again past that first period. So a disappointing game in the end, I would say, for the top line that is supposed to be the top line for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the second line, this is where we had our first substitution. Granlund ends up returning to the lineup. You see, Granlund has played only a single regular season game thus far. That was the first game of the season against the Vegas Golden Knights, and he looked really bad in that game. Didn't end up playing the last few minutes, and this was because he actually re-aggravated a preseason injury in that one, which then kept him out for a few games, a couple of weeks. Returns here tonight, immediately is placed back with William Eklund for that chemistry that David Quinn has been looking to try and develop between these two players since back in preseason, and it actually looks quite good. Not consistently so. It felt as though it was like every third or so shift that this line actually got things rolling, but Granlund definitely looked much better than he did in his debut game with the San Jose Sharks back against Vegas. Clearly is over the injury, at least more over the injury than he was in the past, so that was nice to see. William Eklund, it was a good game for Eklund, don't get me wrong, but I was also slightly disappointed because when I watched him the other night in Carolina against a very strong defensive Carolina team, Eklund was able to shine very well, and so I thought coming into this game against Washington, who are a much weaker team, that Eklund would be able to not exactly take over the game, but have more dominant shifts. And while there were a couple, he had a very nice takeaway in the defensive zone that led to a great chance for Granlund, another very nice takeaway in the third period in the defensive zone that led to a great chance for himself. It felt as though, like I said, every third or so shift he was able to come on and make an impact, while a couple of those shifts in between he'd find himself defending and just losing pucks in the offensive zone. That was slightly disappointing, but all around still a solid game for Eklund for sure. The odd man out continues on this line to be Luke Kunin. Kunin did score a goal, which was nice to see, a classic San Jose Sharks goal for this season. I believe it's like the third time in which a puck comes off the backboards and then is stuffed in by a Sharks player for a goal. So I don't know if that's a really good thing considering that's a lucky bounce, but I guess it's been working out ever so slightly for the San Jose Sharks, who now have just 9 goals in 9 games. But there were other moments in this one where both Granlund and Eklund were setting Kunin up. He was still failing to bury on those chances, and I'd much rather see a player like Fabian Zetterlund perhaps get bumped down to the second line here to play with those two players, or even perhaps a Filip Zadina getting bumped up to the second line, because that does bring the conversation to the third line, which was just a disaster here tonight. If you told me that neither of Zadina, Sturm, or Hoffman actually ended up playing this game, I'd have probably believed you. If you told me the Sharks decided to just roll with 9 forwards, 3 lines tonight, I'd have said that's a bit of an odd choice, but I certainly understand how you would say that's the case, because these 3 players were invisible throughout the entire game. There was no play driving on this line. You would just occasionally say like, oh, Zadina's here, I guess that's interesting. Oh, Hoffman is here, I guess that's interesting. Nothing is going on with these players. This has really been the case for both Hoffman and Zadina as wingers for the past 4 or 5 games. At this point, it feels as though you need to play them with more playmaking type of players. This is why I was always very surprised when they took Zadina off the top line. Why not leave him with Hertl when it was actually working out decently well? But this third line just does zero in this game. And Nico Sturm, after a solid one against Carolina where he was playing with William Eklund, good chemistry there, he's put into a third line role where he's kind of forced to drive this line. It just doesn't end up happening, so this line does nothing. Then when it comes to the fourth line, Smith and LeBanc were paired still with center Ryan Carpenter, and this brings us to a couple of roster moves that the Sharks made today, which was that they sent down Jacob Peterson, very understandable, but they also sent down Thomas Bordeleau, which is also in a way understandable considering he is a player who doesn't have to clear waivers, which means it is, preferable to send him down compared to sending a Mike Hoffman or Philip Zadina down. But I was very surprised to see Ryan Carpenter still be able to keep down a spot instead of Thomas Bordeleau, because like I mentioned last game, the Sharks' major issue has, obviously there's a lot of major issues with the San Jose Sharks, but a big one is the fact that they cannot score any goals, and Ryan Carpenter is not going to be contributing nearly as much as Thomas Bordeleau could in that goal of actually getting more than one goal per game on the board. And so while I don't actually think this was a bad game from Carpenter, in fact, this was a superior game to what he played against Carolina, still rather solid, I do think Thomas Bordeleau would have fit in a bit better, especially even just on this fourth line with LeBanc and Smith, because this was a successful fourth line for the San Jose Sharks. They didn't exactly generate great chances, but they played primarily in the offensive zone, which is more to say about, let's say, the third line right above them, so I guess that's a positive. And so LeBanc and Smith, they definitely needed a bit of a comeback game after a shaky one against Carolina for both of them, and I think that's exactly what they ended up having here. When it comes to the defense, there was also a substitution here, which I'll get to a bit later, but let's start off immediately with the first pairing of Ferraro and Emberson, which continued to be a very surprising but solid pairing for the San Jose Sharks. Ferraro has, of course, been relatively good for much of this season, at least in comparison to the other defensemen that the Sharks are playing thus far, and Emberson, who was just promoted last game and played quite well, again plays another solid game here tonight, and in fact picks up his first career point in the NHL on the Luke Cunnin goal. He is the defenseman who took the shot that bounced off the backboard that led to the Luke Cunnin goal. So it's not exactly an amazing assist, but it is one nonetheless, and it's one that he'll take for sure as his first NHL point. But I've definitely begun to like Emberson as a player, and so I'm happy that David Quinn has kept him in the lineup. However, that comes to the casualty of another player who I will get to right now, because if we take a look at the third pairing, we see that Matt Benning stepped back into the lineup after not playing against Carolina due to a sort of small injury to him. But instead of a player like Jan Ruda stepping out of the lineup, a right-handed defenseman stepping out, considering Ruda has been awful thus far this season, instead it is Nikolai Knyzhov, who honestly had been one of the better defensemen for the San Jose Sharks throughout. He gets benched. So I'm not exactly sure the thought process. I mentioned Ruda because then you could at least have the 3 right-handed defensemen and the 3 left-handed defensemen. But if you wanted to keep 4 right-handed defensemen in the lineup like the Sharks did here tonight, the other very, very easy bench would have been Marc-Edouard Vlasic. David Quinn has already healthy scratched Vlasic 2 times this season. He then brings him back in the lineup for the Carolina game. Vlasic was the worst defenseman in that game against Carolina, and yet for whatever reason he manages to stay in the lineup for a second straight, like as though he somehow learned his lesson after being terrible against the Hurricanes. That just doesn't make much sense to me. And if Knyzhov was already kind of borderline, I wouldn't really be all that upset about it, but he hasn't been borderline. He's been good, so I don't know the logic here, but it ends up not really working out for San Jose because Vlasic was again perhaps the worst defenseman for the San Jose Sharks for the Sharks have played 9 games. I wouldn't be surprised if he's been the worst defenseman for the Sharks in 6 of those 9 games, and Vlasic himself has only played 7, so that makes it look even worse. Burrows, who has been one of the better defensemen as well for the San Jose Sharks, is kind of getting dragged down by Vlasic, so he didn't have a particularly good game either. The only sort of bright side, I guess you could say, when it comes to the third pairing is that I thought Ruda was not as much of a disaster as he has previously been this season. Ruda was okay, which, like I said, is much better than I could have said about him in many other games thus far. So Is that like a building block towards the future? Probably not. The Capitals are a weak team. That's likely why Ruda doesn't look all that bad, but it's a positive nonetheless. And then when it comes to Matt Benning, he returns to the lineup, looks decent, nothing amazing. Classic Matt Benning thus far this year. And then finally, we have the goaltender for the San Jose Sharks. No surprise that Blackwood gets back between the pipes here for the San Jose Sharks. Has been very, very good throughout thus far this season, even though he doesn't have a win, of course, because the Sharks as a whole don't have a win, but his stats are trying to hold up as much as possible in a world in which the Sharks allow like 40 shots per game onto him, and he played his heart out in this one for sure. The first goal, I would say, probably could have had the first goal for sure. Definitely rather weak one. The second one from Wilson, no real chance on that. Awkward deflection. So technically he only let up one bad one, and the Sharks scored one goal themselves, so this game likely should have been able to go to overtime, but unfortunately the lucky bounce does not go their way, and Blackwood, who ended up making close to 40 saves in this game otherwise, is left with another loss. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They'll be back at home. They'll be taking on the Vancouver Canucks, and well, the only thing to really be said here is that we can only hope for a Sharks win to finally occur, or will they start the season with 10 losses in a row? Class dismissed.